In a crowded courtroom, Officer Daniel Hargrove's temper flared. His boot striking a black woman he assumed was just another defendant, until her piercing gaze met his, and the chilling realization hit. She wasn't just anyone. She was his new police chief, and his world was about to unravel. Daniel Hargrove had been a cop for 12 years in the small, tightly knit town of Crestwood, where everyone knew everyone, and trust in the badge was hard-earned. At 38, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the streets, the people, and the unspoken rules that kept things in order. His record wasn't spotless. Complaints about excessive force and biased stops had piled up over the years, but he always managed to skate by. Crestwood's police department was a brotherhood, and loyalty often trumped accountability. It was a humid Tuesday morning in late July when the incident happened. The Crestwood County Courthouse was packed, the air thick with tension from a high-profile assault case involving a local gang. Hargrove was there to testify. His uniform crisp, his demeanor impatient. He hated court days. Too much sitting around, too many suits throwing around legal jargon. He stood near the back of the courtroom, arms crossed, scanning the crowd with a scowl. That's when he saw her. A black woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a sharp blazer and skirt, sitting quietly in the front row. To Hargrove she looked out of place. Her presence irritated him, though he couldn't quite say why. Maybe it was the way she sat, composed and unbothered, while everyone else fidgeted under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Maybe it was the way she glanced at him, her eyes sharp and unflinching like she was sizing him up. Whatever it was, it set him on edge. The judge called a recess, and the room erupted into movement. People shuffled toward the exits, voices overlapping. Hargrove stayed put, his gaze still locked on the woman. She stood, gathering her papers, and started walking toward the aisle. As she passed, someone bumped into her, sending her briefcase tumbling to the floor. Papers scattered, and she bent to pick them up. Hargrove saw his chance. He didn't know why he felt the need to act. Maybe it was the heat, the frustration of the day, or something darker he'd never admit to himself. He stepped forward, his boot deliberately connecting with her hand as she reached for a document. It wasn't a hard kick, but it was intentional, meant to send a message. "Watch where you're going," he muttered, his voice low and edged with disdain. The woman froze. Slowly, she lifted her head, her eyes locking onto his. There was no fear in her gaze, no anger, just a calm, piercing intensity that made Hargrove's skin prickle. She stood, brushing off her hand, and squared her shoulders. "You must be Officer Hargrove," she said, her voice steady, almost too calm. "I'll remember that." Hargrove smirked, assuming she was just another civilian trying to act tough. "Yeah, sure," he said, turning away. He didn't give her another thought as he left the courtroom, his mind already on grabbing a coffee before heading back to the station. He had no idea who she was, no idea what he'd just done. The next morning, Hargrove walked into the Crestwood Police Department like he always did, badge gleaming, coffee in hand. The station was buzzing more than usual, officers huddled in small groups, whispering. Hargrove caught snippets of their conversations, something about a new chief, someone from out of town. He shrugged it off. Chiefs came and went, and he'd outlasted 3 already. He wasn't worried. At 9 a.m., the department gathered in the briefing room for the official introduction. Captain Malone, a grizzled veteran who'd mentored Hargrove early on, stood at the front, looking unusually tense. "All right, listen up," Malone said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We've got a new chief starting today. She's got big plans for this department, and I expect everyone to fall in line." Hargrove leaned back in his chair, half listening, until Malone stepped aside, and the new chief walked in. The room went silent. Hargrove's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. It was her, the woman from the courtroom, the one he'd kicked. She stood tall, her presence commanding, her eyes scanning the room with the same intensity he'd seen the day before. Only now, she wore a chief's uniform, the gold stars on her collar glinting under the lights. "This is Chief Adrienne Marshall," Malone said. She comes to us from the Atlanta PD, where she served as deputy chief for 5 years. She's got 20 years of law enforcement experience, and she's here to shake things up." Hargrove's stomach dropped. His mind raced, replaying the courtroom incident. A kick. Her words. "I'll remember that." He tried to shrink into his seat, hoping she wouldn't notice him, but her eyes found his almost immediately. They lingered, cold and unyielding, before moving on to the rest of the room. "Thank you, Captain," Chief Marshall said, stepping forward. Her voice was clear, authoritative, with a slight southern drawl that carried weight. "I've been brought here because Crestwood has a problem. This department has a reputation, use of force complaints, allegations of bias, and a conviction rate that's frankly embarrassing. I'm here to fix that. Starting today, things change." She didn't look at Hargrove again, but he felt the weight of her words like a spotlight. He shifted uncomfortably, his palms sweating. The other officers glanced at each other, some nodding, others skeptical. Hargrove kept his head down, his mind spinning. How had this happened? How had he not known? Adrienne Marshall wasn't new to tough rooms. She'd climbed the ranks in Atlanta, a city with its own share of racial and political tensions. She'd faced skepticism, hostility, and worse, but she'd never backed down. Crestwood was smaller, but she knew small towns could hide big problems. She'd done her homework before taking the job, read the reports, studied the data. Crestwood's police department had a pattern of complaints, particularly from Black and Latino residents. Excessive force, racial profiling, questionable arrests. And one name kept popping up. Daniel Hargrove. When she'd walked into the courtroom the day before, she hadn't planned to make a scene. She was there to observe, to get a feel for the town before her first official day. But Hargrove's actions, his deliberate kick, his dismissive tone, had confirmed what she'd suspected. He was the kind of officer who thought he was untouchable. After the briefing, Marshall called Hargrove into her office. He walked in, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a tense, almost defiant posture. She sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. "Close the door, officer," she said. Hargrove did as he was told, his jaw tight. He stood in front of her desk, waiting for the hammer to fall. Marshall leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You know why you're here," she said. It wasn't a question. Hargrove shifted his weight. "Look, Chief, about yesterday." "Don't," she cut him off, her voice sharp but controlled. "Don't make excuses. I know exactly what happened. You thought I was just some nobody you could push around. You were wrong." Hargrove opened his mouth to protest, but the look in her eyes stopped him. There was no room for argument. "I've read your file," she continued. 13 complaints in 12 years. 5 involving excessive force. 3 alleging racial bias. None resulted in discipline. That ends now. Hargrove's face flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Those complaints were baseless," he said, his voice low. "People lie to get out of trouble. You know how it is." Marshall's eyes narrowed. "What I know is that you've got a pattern, officer. And patterns don't lie. People do." She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. "You're on desk duty until further notice. You'll also be attending mandatory sensitivity training and a review of use of force protocols. And if I hear one whisper of you stepping out of line, you're done. Am I clear?" Hargrove's fists clenched at his sides, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said. "Now get out." The news spread through the department like wildfire. Hargrove, the tough guy, the one who always got away with it, was on a leash. Some officers were stunned. Others were quietly pleased. 4 years, Hargrove's behavior had been an open secret, but no one had dared challenge him. The Brotherhood protected its own. But Marshall wasn't part of that Brotherhood, and she wasn't afraid to break it. Over the next few weeks, Marshall rolled out changes. Body cameras became mandatory, no exceptions. She implemented community outreach programs, forcing officers to meet with residents in the neighborhoods they patrolled. She brought in trainers from outside the department to teach de-escalation techniques, focusing on situations involving race and mental health crises. Complaints were no longer swept under the rug. Everyone was investigated thoroughly, and officers were held accountable. Hargrove, meanwhile, was miserable. Desk duty was a humiliation, a constant reminder of his fall from grace. He spent his days filing reports, answering phones, and watching his colleagues hit the streets without him. He told himself he'd ride it out, that Marshall would move on to some other crusade eventually. But deep down, he knew she wasn't going anywhere. The sensitivity training was the worst part. Hargrove sat through hours of lectures on implicit bias, systemic racism, and the history of policing in minority communities. He rolled his eyes through most of it, convinced it was all a waste of time. But one session hit harder than he expected. The trainer, a former cop from Chicago, shared a story about a black teenager he'd wrongfully arrested early in his career. The kid had done nothing wrong, but the trainer had acted on a hunch, fueled by stereotypes he didn't even realize he held. The arrest had cost the kid a scholarship, derailed his future. The trainer's voice cracked as he spoke, and for the first time, Hargrove felt a pang of something. Guilt, maybe, or shame. He started thinking about the courtroom incident. The way he'd lashed out at Marshall without a second thought. The way he'd justified it to himself, assuming she was just another troublemaker. He tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept creeping back. 3 months into Marshall's tenure, the department was starting to change. Complaints dropped by 20%. Community meetings were packed with residents, especially from Crestwood's Black and Latino neighborhoods, starting to trust that their voices might actually be heard. Marshall was relentless, meeting with local leaders, reviewing every policy, and holding officers to a standard most hadn't faced before. Hargrove, though, was still a problem. He'd returned to patrol after a month on desk duty, but Marshall kept a close eye on him. His colleagues noticed it too. He wasn't the same cocky officer he'd been before. He was quieter, more cautious, but there was still an edge to him, a resentment that simmered just below the surface. Then came the call that changed everything. It was a domestic disturbance in one of Crestwood's rougher neighborhoods. Hargrove and his partner, Officer Jenna Ruiz, responded. The call was routine at first, a neighbor reporting yelling and crashing sounds from a nearby apartment. When they arrived, they found a young black couple arguing loudly in their living room. The man, Marcus, was pacing, his hands clenched. The woman, Keisha, was crying, holding a broken lamp. Hargrove's instincts kicked in. He saw Marcus's agitation, the clenched fists, and his mind jumped to conclusions. "Step back now," he barked, his hand already on his holster. Marcus froze, his eyes wide with fear. Keisha stepped between them, pleading. "He didn't do anything. We're just arguing." Ruiz tried to de-escalate, her voice calm. "Let's all take a breath, okay? We're just here to make sure everyone's safe." But Hargrove wasn't listening. He grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it behind his back, ready to cuff him. Marcus yelped in pain and Keisha screamed. "Stop it! You're hurting him." That's when Marshall's voice crackled through Hargrove's radio. She'd been monitoring calls from the station, a habit she'd picked up to keep tabs on her officers. "Officer Hargrove, stand down," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm on my way." Hargrove hesitated, his grip on Marcus tightening for a split second before he let go. Marcus stumbled back, rubbing his arm. Keisha glared at Hargrove, tears streaming down her face. Ruiz stepped in, talking softly to the couple, trying to calm them down. Marshall arrived within minutes, her presence filling the room. She didn't look at Hargrove as she approached Marcus and Keisha, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm Chief Marshall. I need to know what happened here. Can you talk to me?" Keisha explained through sobs. A fight over money, stress from work, the lamp breaking by accident. Marcus nodded, his voice shaky as he confirmed her story. Marshall listened, her focus entirely on them. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make assumptions. She just listened. When they were done, she turned to Hargrove. "Outside. Now." Hargrove followed her, his heart pounding. They stood on the apartment building's front steps, the night air cool against his flushed skin. Marshall's eyes were like steel. "You were about to arrest a man based on nothing but your own assumptions," she said. "No evidence, no weapon, no threat. Just a hunch. That's not policing. That's prejudice." Hargrove's jaw clenched. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice tight. He looked like he was about to. "About to what?" Marshall cut him off. "Raise his voice. Argue with his girlfriend. You saw a black man and decided he was dangerous. That's not a hunch, officer. That's bias." Hargrove wanted to argue to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. He thought about the sensitivity training, the trainer's story, the courtroom incident. He thought about Marcus's face, the fear in his eyes. For the first time, Hargrove didn't have an answer. "You're suspended," Marshall said. 2 weeks unpaid. And when you come back, you're on probation. One more incident like this, and you're out. Permanently." The suspension hit Hargrove hard. He spent the first few days at home, stewing in anger, convincing himself he was the victim. But as the days dragged on, the anger gave way to something else, doubt. He started replaying every call, every arrest, every complaint. Had he been wrong? Not always, he told himself. But sometimes. Maybe. On the 10th day of his suspension, he did something he never thought he would. He drove to the local community center, where Marshall was holding another outreach meeting. He didn't go inside, just sat in his truck, watching through the window as she spoke to a room full of residents. They were listening, really listening, in a way he'd never seen before. He saw Keisha from the domestic call there, nodding as Marshall spoke about trust and accountability. Hargrove didn't know what to make of it. He didn't know if he could change, or if he even wanted to. But for the first time in his career, he was questioning himself. And that scared him more than anything. When he returned to work, he kept his head down. Marshall was still watching him, but she wasn't cruel. She didn't single him out, didn't humiliate him. She just expected better. And slowly, some of the other officers started to change too. Ruiz, his partner, started calling.